Hello, and welcome to today's health webinar. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Suki. We would like to remind you that the Q&A feature is available, so feel free to send in your questions and comments throughout today's webinar. We would love to hear from you. And with that, I will turn over to our moderator, Julie Carty.
Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the future of care delivery, defining a real AI strategy for what's next. My name is Julie Carty. I am the Head of Strategy and Growth for Health Community, and I have the great pleasure of being the moderator for today's conversation. So today we have a really interesting topic. We'll look at defining clinical intelligence. We'll look at what the building blocks for a successful strategy is. We'll look at what are some of the pitfalls and mistakes when planning a strategy. And it wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't hypothesize on the future. We have a very, very large group here today. So what we'll do is aim to have a discussion for about 45 minutes, hoping to leave 15 minutes at the back end for you to ask questions. You can put them in the Q&A and we will get to as many as we can at the end. And I'm really excited to introduce our panel of leaders here today. Each of them have a very different perspective, and I think it's going to be an amazing conversation. So Abby, please introduce yourself.
Of course. Hello, everyone. I'm Abhi Pathak, Chief Product Officer at Suki. We build the ambient clinical intelligence layer that sits across documentation, coding, and increasingly care workflows for health systems directly, and also embedded inside platforms like EHRs, telehealth, and smart rooms. So super excited to discuss future of AI strategy here.
Thanks, Abby. Bobby, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Bobby Sherwood, VP of Product for Care Solutions at HealthEdge. HealthEdge offers the software and services used by health plans across the country to manage their operations and their populations. And Care Solutions is the care management member engagement platform that sits within that. Really excited to be here today and share a bit more from the payer perspective on how AI and clinical ambient intelligence is being used to impact care delivery. So thanks.
Thanks, Bobby. Ruben, over to you.
Thank you for having me. My name is Ruben Amarsingham. I am the Chief Medical Officer for Smarter DX, and part of that, the founder and CEO of Pieces Technologies, which was acquired by Smarter. Smarter's mission is to help health systems with revenue cycle management all the way from documentation all the way to final billing. And we use AI systems to support doctors, nurses, and the back-end providers that are supporting billing and coding. And excited to speak about our ambient strategy. Thank you.
Welcome, Ruben. And last but not least, Suchi.
Thank you so much for having me. I am Suchi Saria. I hold two titles. One is the founder, CEO of Bayesian Health, and I'll shortly say a few things about Bayesian. I also am the director of AI and Healthcare Lab at Johns Hopkins and hold the John C. Malone Endowed Chair there in AI and Health. A little bit about Bayesian. It's a platform that is integrated with leading EMR providers like Epic and Cerner and helps hospitals by effectively analyzing not just text data, but really the massively multimodal streams of data that are available in real time to do clinical reasoning and to provide proactive clinical insights around preventable harms, preventable complications that are life-threatening, and combining that with modern AI-powered workflows that makes it really easy to do all the follow-through next steps to close and take action. The work itself is applicable in hundreds of areas, but we've kind of targeted the highest drivers of mortality and utilization. And that's where our focus is today. Excited to talk about how this fits into ambient clinical.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and really excited to jump into the discussion. Before jumping in, I just wanted to establish a shared understanding. There are a lot of folks on this webinar today. So for those who aren't aware, I wanted to talk about what do we really mean when we say ambient clinical intelligence and clinical AI in general. So it can span things like ambient documentation, that is scaling really among a lot of health systems in the US. Vive really brought that to light earlier this year for me, to clinical decision support that have FDA clearance, to things like agentic systems that are, I'd say, somewhat aspirational for a lot of health systems today, but something everyone is thinking about. So Abby, for those that are less familiar in the space, please can you share what is ambient clinical intelligence and how is it different from ambient scribing as well?
Of course, happy to, Julie. I think I want to set the stage with, well, ambient scribing is definitely one of the most well-known application of ambient clinical intelligence. It's the capture and draft and note layer. But the way we define ambient clinical intelligence is full stack underneath, which is continuous context aware and listening across the encounter that eventually stages orders, flags any documentation gaps, and supports the workflows around the visit, not just the node. So we're looking at it more holistically. And the way we define it in terms of capabilities is essentially 4 pillars. Like first is ambient documentation, is the quintessential patient-doctor conversation and capturing that node. But the second is what we call clinical reasoning, which is once you have the encounter data, once you have the patient data, then you could reason with that to help clinicians with, for example, patient summaries, like what does this patient need today? Asking any question about the patient or their general medical. So that what we're calling the clinical reasoning pillar. And then the third pillar is assisted revenue cycle, which is many of the documentation burden today is all about billing. Did we document enough? Did we have enough specificity to drive that billing logic later on? So the one goal of ambient clinical intelligence is to bring that specificity right during the encounter. So it's not a problem 3 weeks later. That is very hard to fix, but during the encounter, driving that claims ready documentation and fixing those gaps. And the final pillar is what we call clinical operations, which is about the business of medicine that starts pre-visit, but also goes all the way post-visit and driving things, workflows like prior authorization or referrals. This is where bulk of the healthcare administrative burden is. And this is where the healthcare in general is most fragmented. So connecting those pieces together with during encounter and driving ambient throughout the workflow end to end across the clinical journey is what we call ambient clinical intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Thank you. I think it's important to set the scene because sometimes our heads all go to scribing. Suki, your work at Bayesian Health involves FDA cleared clinical decision support. How is that different, especially from like that second pillar Abby mentioned, the clinical reasoning? Can you kind of share a little bit about how that's different?
Yeah, I think like reasoning can be done at many levels, right? There's at the level of like somebody tells you if somebody's heart rate is up, then consider ordering this medication. So that's not reasoning so much as applying automation logic, which is I know from rules I've already been given, I can parse the data, munch the data, and apply it. And then I'll go up a few levels where you're doing clinical discovery. So for instance, for the kind of work we are doing, where we're doing early detection of sepsis to identify patients at risk. And if you can do that well, accurately and early, which turns out to be a ridiculously hard problem, but if you can, you can reduce mortality by 20-30% in hospitals, and you can really truly move treatment times earlier. But to do that well, there are a lot of other hurdles you have to cross beyond the example I gave, right? So for instance, today a lot of AI is ingesting text data to make sense of text data through transcription, summarization, or applying kinds of clinical logic that Abhi was describing, like, this person needs this particular follow-up because it was described or it was mentioned. But when you're trying to reason about something like a preventable complication like sepsis or HAPI, there are hundreds of these complications. You really need to make sense of this patient's longitudinal data, the continuous measured data, right? Like the information is not in the text alone. Text is giving you a sense of
Yeah.
their clinical history, their comorbidities, maybe what their current symptoms are. But then you have to think about this in the context of other things that have happened, including past encounters, what is normal for you given your clinical history. How do your signals in constellation change? The fact that you've already been on Coumadin, which is a medication that elevates INR levels, therefore I'm no longer worried that your INR levels are elevated, and I don't need to attribute that to something is wrong. So I think there's sort of like reason can be done at varying levels. And, as humans, we know how to leverage various parts of our brain. I'd say like that kinds of what I'm super excited about is now that, like Abhi described, the data is there. Obviously getting access to real-time comprehensive multimodal data is a lot harder than just text data. So you also need those pipes to be able to do
Mhm.
that real-time comprehensive, both data access, read, write, two-way, and analysis. On the flip side, what we've been able to show is if you can do that, then it really opens up a whole host of problems where you can actually give superhuman performance, right? Like you can do better than what clinicians are doing today. You're not just automating the logic, you're giving them brand new AI-driven interventional workflows that are like
Mhm.
drugs, basically improving patient outcomes, improving hospital outcomes.
Makes sense. Thank you, Suchi. And I guess the adding in this ambient text provides so much richer data for all these systems and all these models. But I think it's important, yeah, to just talk about those, the different levels of that clinical reasoning and distinguish between them. And Ruben, you've worked with multiple health systems, and as AI capabilities are continuing to expand, we've talked about some of them here. What are health systems and clinicians actually asking for today? And I'm wondering, are they interested in individual use cases, or are they now starting to think about how AI, in its many different forms, many different capabilities, fits into the broader care experience that they can deliver?
It's a great question. I think we're still in the stage where people are asking for individual use cases. I
Okay,
think people
interesting.
are experiencing AI in their normal lives in a way that has never been experienced before. In sort of the just regular daily consumer life, people are experimenting with AI. And so they're expecting that and want that within their clinical experience. So I think you're seeing more and more clinicians saying, can we do this or that?
Mhm.
And then you're also seeing health systems recognize that, they have to all chart their own quote unquote roadmap for
Yeah.
their AI journey. And they have to decide how much do they want to standardize, how much do they want to kind of open tools up. So I think you're seeing a lot of it's a very kind of uh, organically developing situation. We're just in the early innings, which is really interesting. I've thought about this question, and one of the interesting things that we're starting to see in talking to health systems is, about 2 years ago, generating clinical documents was novel, right? I mean, there was the ambient translation to documents was a breakout hit and was considered pretty novel. Now it's considered table stakes. And
Yeah.
then even other types of documents that are not ambient generated, that are taking all the information and trying to support that for clinical documentation, for billing. Uh, there's a lot of different ways that this can be done, and everything looks good in a demo, right? I mean, you can easily generate documents, and on the surface, they all look the same. So the question I think health systems are trying to determine is, how do you determine what's going to be the most accurate and safe and clinically authentic? And that's much harder because a lot of generative output looks good on the surface, but how nuanced is it, and how faithful is it to what's actually happening in the clinical process? So that's what seem to be a lot of the conversations with health systems in
Mhm.
determining that. And then the last thing is, I think we've moved out of the phase of early experimentation. Everyone's experimenting. And now people are really asking about hard dollar ROI. And the health systems are still having very tight margins, 1% margin. And so the time to there's time to clinical value, but even probably more importantly is time to financial value. And that's a little bit harder because clinical workflows, while being very beneficial for clinicians, being able to drive that into financial value, I think, is where a lot of health systems are really focused.
Yeah, makes sense. And Ruben, thank you so much for that. And thank you for mentioning how far we've come in the past 2 years. And you're absolutely right. It's incredible the pace of technology and transformation, evolution has really increased. So yeah, I was really curious about the questions you're being asked, but I think you're dead right to mention how far we've come kind of collectively. And I think that's really evident in the things that we were talking about today and during other sessions as well. And Bobby, from a product and implementation standpoint, are you solving the same questions and are you building similar products as a couple of years ago, or have you found that the questions that Health Edge are coming to you or the payers are coming to you with, or your partners has changed a lot?
Yeah, the payer space is interesting in that in general, I'd say we are lagging behind the health system world in AI adoption. In virtually every use case, ambient documentation, for example, is really not adopted at scale anywhere, which is kind of shocking given the success it has had in the provider world. But our health plans, they serve nurses just like health systems do. So they're all aware of what is out there and what can be done. So they're asking very similar questions, asking for the same types of things. We're just seeing more hesitation, both when it comes to governance and trust. This is healthcare, so I think the tolerance for risk is a bit lower, given the impact it can have on people's lives and also the compliance risks that can come with it as well. And we're getting the same questions of ROI, and wanting proof points and production data around, I like the way you phrased it, Ruben, time to financial value. We're seeing a lot of experimentation, which I think is a great thing across a number of use cases. But scaled adoption and rollout seems to be lagging. And part of the focus I have is sort of Health Edge again as an enterprise platform is, as was stated, there's an abundance of point solutions where I service this specific step in a workflow or in a process or this population or this need. And part of my focus is helping piece those together and orchestrate those in a cohesive system, a cohesive workflow where one can inform the next, even if the information is coming from different partners and different vendors, because I have to own the end-to-end process. I have to own the end-to-end data set. And it can be challenging, given how quickly things are evolving and how many systems there actually are out there to work with.
Thank you, Bobby. I think there's absolutely two things that we need to dig into later. One is the ROI, and then secondly, it's interesting what you and both yourself and Ruben said, that it still is largely individual point solutions. People are coming to you with individual use cases, but you guys, as I think innovators and leaders, you understand you need to bring them all together. And what does this mean in an enterprise-wide strategy? So excited to dig into that. So thank you guys. I think we've established that ambient clinical intelligence is everything from the documentation to the clinical guidance, as we mentioned, and the workflow restriction. And we've also established that everybody is experimenting. So using AI is no longer a differentiator at all, but the differentiation can come in, or the competitive advantage, into the strategy and how you are deploying it, what AI you are deploying, how you're implementing it, how you're governing it, how you're integrating it into workflow, and how you're ultimately scaling it, and how you're proving ROI, as you all have mentioned. So let's talk about that execution. Bobby, I start with you here. What do you think a mature AI strategy actually looks like in practice? Because feels like you're the guy who's bringing a lot of these things together internally.
I think it has to start from your very first use case with your governance framework. If you don't have that well defined, no one's going to use what you build. Every health plan that we work with, whether they're a current customer or a soon-to-be customer, those are the questions they dig into the most. To Ruben's point, you can easily build a very shiny demo that looks great. You can use AI to build the demo, but it has to come down to a well thought out design that's got the right PHI control, security, governance, auditability, etc., or you'll never get it off the ground. And that's something that we established very, very early on, and ensure that we're pulling in and incorporating the right internal leaders from product and engineering and legal, but also referencing the correct industry standards and benchmarks as well that we could use as a reference point. After that, and once you have that figured out, speed is very important. The market is moving shockingly quickly, and so you have to be comfortable with speed. And more specifically, I'll say, the way developing an AI solution is inherently different than a software solution. The software, it's deterministic. You're going to have the same outputs for the same input every time, guaranteed, and it's very, very easy to test it and iterate on it. AI and generative AI is inherently different every time. And so something that we're trying to do more of and get better at is shift left the exposure of the AI models and the testing of that input and output well ahead of actually the software readiness. We know how to build the software. We know how to do that with very low risk and how long that takes. What we're finding is it takes an enormous amount of time to train a model well, where it can meet the expected quality outputs of recall and hallucinations and etc. at the thresholds our customers expect. So move quickly, but specifically move quickly in getting your model to a point where it can be tested, non-PHI environments, of course, with your customers and your end users, so that you can start working on that feedback cycle and iteration cycle. Don't treat it like a normal software development project.
That's really helpful and practical to know. And Bobby, I'm curious, since ROI has already been mentioned a number of times, do you build that into the strategy when you're doing pilots or experimenting from the get-go, like building in economic studies while you're exploring the algorithm?
Yeah, so we always start with the hypothesis of the value statement, right? It's got to be worth building and worth investing in, and worth it for our customers to use. So we'll always start with forecasting the ROI, and then the expectation of those pilot customers that we work with very early on is that they're helping us validate that hypothesis. Typically at this point, the ROI is heavily anchored around staff efficiency, time savings. It's the most direct thing that you can measure and attribute to that feature. Ideally, where we want to be able to start demonstrating ROI is actually impacting the spend health plans have on taking care of the populations, improving overall health while reducing the actual cost that it takes to get members healthy. But that is a longer tail to get there, and also just harder to attribute directly to the AI models.
Makes sense. And Ruben, kind of similar question to you. If you walked into a health system and had a conversation with the CIO, the CEO, what would tell you they had a genuine AI strategy versus, reactive experimentation mode?
Yeah, no, I think definitely it's maturing across the industry, but you're seeing health systems being more and more deliberate about owning their AI strategy, and that comes in the form of first their clinical governance, clinical AI governance teams and committees that are involved with both evaluating the products that they're going to be bringing into the environment, determining how much they'll utilize the inherent services, the electronic medical record versus electronic health record versus bringing outside vendors, how much they're going to allow for on-the-ground development by their own teams through a variety of ways, the controls that they're placing, the role of the clinical experts to determine how the new workflows are going to change. And so we've seen, different tiers of activity on that, where there's health systems that have a planned roadmap for bringing in products and capabilities and services that are 2 or 3 years out, versus other systems where they're trying to take advantage of what their sort of native systems already have. And so I think we're still in a phase where we're seeing kind of a wide variety of maturity on this respect. But clearly what we're seeing now that wasn't present 2 years ago is everyone believes that AI could be potentially transformational, and really support their staff and to create tremendous efficiencies and safer care. So I think everyone recognizes that needs to be done. I think I haven't talked to a health system in the last 12 months that isn't anxious about aggressively tackling AI. And I think it's just a matter of where they are on that maturity continuum that I outlined.
Makes sense. And Ruben, or sorry, Abby, I wanted to ask you a similar question as well, because you've worked with a lot of organizations, and I assume at very different levels of maturity, like Ruben has mentioned. I'm curious, is there a common thread between those that are more mature, let's say, that they are doing or that you feel like they are getting right? And kind of conversely, are there some mistakes that you see folks making that are less mature?
Yeah, no, let me be a little provocative. I think just the question
Please.
that whether you have an AI strategy, I always chuckle at that question, because my prediction is like in 2 years, we won't have the sentence people saying, do we have an AI strategy? It sounds odd as somebody who has seen the internet and then mobile. It's like saying, do you have an internet strategy or do you have a digital strategy? So I think as the category gets more mature, as Ruben was calling out, and as Bobby said, the experimentation becomes more real, with real values, I think we'll evolve our vocabulary and how we talk about this. But to me, what the common theme I see in terms of companies who are getting this right or who would have a durable advantage are the ones who are talking about the strategy and getting it right early on. They're very clear on what the differentiation is, like what they own, what they don't own, like where are they uniquely situated. And they're very disciplined about where they invest. And then I think Bobby touched on this, and they're fast to deliver what clinicians actually need. And Ruben mentioned time to financial value. So I think showing all that and getting all that right is part of like what it gets to deliver a successful AI strategy. And I think where in one area that I feel like gets very underweighted is adoption. Thinking about adoption as a bolt-on metric is what I've seen some of the failure mode, that, hey, we're going to build something, this is exciting, but then nobody thought about who's going to use it. How will you train your people? How do you manage the change management? Because they're built-in workflows. So taking adoption as a designed strategy from day one, not an afterthought, is one of the sophistication that I'm seeing some of our clients are getting right, and then many others are floundering. So that's one of the things I wanted to add.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and it comes up time and time again in our roundtables as well. Maybe Suchi, to double down on that. So you've spent years translating AI research from labs to clinical practice and building AI that clinicians actually use. So, what are the lessons you've learned that drives adoption with clinicians? So Abby mentioned thinking about it early in the strategy and actually giving it the time and effort it deserves and designing for that adoption phase. Is there anything you can add in terms of things that have worked well?
Yeah, I'm going to just double down on that because
Okay.
I think it's important point, and because the failure is usually not technical, like AI luckily is not that hard to use. The failure mode is usually strategic. So the common thread is the organization that treat clinical value, financial value, and adoption as a requirement early on, not just AI for the sake of AI, are the ones that are being successful. And we have some real cross-organization data on this now. We just had the 2026 class ROI validation where 3 of our health system partners, FMAOL Health, McLeod Health, and Rush, reported 35-65% reduction in after-hours documentation, and also over 1,200 in average incremental revenue per provider per month. So those results come from systems that started with a clinical workflow problem and measured against it. So it's not from, we need an AI strategy, let's run some experiments. So biggest mistake is that, which is treating AI as a feature instead of a business decision. So teams ship a pilot, you usually get a decent usage, and there's no instrumented path from pilot to that business outcome or that financial outcome. So 6 months later, leadership cannot even tell if it worked. So it has to start with the end user. What problem is the clinician trying to solve? How will we make that materially better? How will we add value? How will we prove value, both from clinical staff as well as financial perspective? An organization that start there, I've noticed, built differently, they drive adoption faster because it was built in and not just bolted on.
Makes sense. Thanks for jumping in with the mistake that you see health systems make. Suchi, on the clinical adoption, just wondering if you have anything to add from your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So today, most best-in-class informatics labs around the country where they have, a big team of clinicians who are optimizing Epic and using various like CDS tools or alerting tools or order set tools. What we found in research, what we found in our day-to-day interactions with them is best-in-class teams show something like 10 to 12% adoption. It's pretty bad. And up until in 22, we published these large papers showing 90% adoption on our system deployed across 4,400 clinicians using it sustained over 2.5 year period. And when we published that, it was interesting because people were like so skeptical that it was even possible. That was literally like people were like, we never break the 10-15% barrier. It's not possible. And it's true. It was extremely hard to get there. It took 5 years of deep commitment and research and lots of innovation to get there. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I think the first thing is in any one of the problem areas we're tackling, the first thing is people completely underestimate. They think like some DIY model, like they're not measuring signal quality well. It's hard to, clinical trials are expensive. Companies invest millions of dollars in running a clinical trial. How can you expect a small health system team? Like when you think of these models, these CDS models that are driving intervention, you can think of them like a drug. It's like bringing a new drug to market. How can you expect a small team, this is one of the 500 jobs they have to do, to both design and evaluate and build and run and maintain anything at the level of quality that is needed to really get these things to work? So to me, like the first gap we saw was the quality of the signal was so bad, like lacking in so many ways that effectively if you're pushing so much noise to the frontline clinicians, ultimately they're very well-trained professionals, they're not going to use it and they tend to ignore it. Like sepsis is a graveyard of companies who built solutions and failed, probably 50 plus at this point. And one of the biggest starting point failures were that they just never took the time to do high quality evaluations against clinical practice. They're doing it against billing code data, which is highly misleading. They don't really understand what the clinical problem here is, which is early detection, which is what's leading to length of stay reduction, mortality reduction. They're thinking of it as just like as long as I flag, but if 95% of your flags are happening after a provider has already initiated treatment, that's mostly going to be a nuisance alert. So first challenge is like, how do you build not just a model that does well in a data science experiment, but a system that is going to deliver high quality, reliable signals in real time that are performant across many different settings. Like your ED, you have very sparse data. Critical care, you have dense data. Community hospital, different practice pattern. Then your academic medical center, different complexity of subpopulations, high acuity trauma center. So how do you get these models to really work across these very diverse settings with very diverse practice patterns at the level of quality that is where they're gonna, it's providing clinical value. And to do that work was like a huge amount of investment. Second is even when you've built something really important that works well now, the question is how is it going to stay performant? That's where the system is really important, because a model staying performant is the ability to monitor drifts and shifts and to be ability to tune and retrain and reevaluate. It's like running a clinical trial continuously, or running like that's a huge investment. If you don't put in the energy to do that, like, it's not going to happen in happenstance, right? So that's sort of the second thing. How do you continue to stay performant? And then the third is like, let's assume you've got now high quality signals, you've got a system that can keep it performant, it's delivered within workflow in a way that's easy to use. Then there's the issue, and like it's very interesting at Hopkins when we first started doing this work in 2018. We were like, wow, this looks really beautiful. And we delivered it. 2 clinicians used it. It was so disheartening. Like, we basically were like, this is so wild. The data shows it works. Why aren't they using it? And so that led me to down this research path of what's called human machine teaming or human clinician teaming. How do you use physician models of trust building to learn principles of what's going to take to get them to trust and adopt? And how do you design the interfaces and the tooling in a way that they will trust and adopt? And, there's lots of research we could point to in that. This is a very exciting area. There's a lot, but we think of it almost, so we built our approach basically on a theory of behavior change that we call ADAPT. First is, like I said, all of the adaptive AI that's tuning and adapting in real time to drifts and shifts in workflow, which is very key. Second is the collaborative change management process. How do you bring the system where you're not just throwing something at them, you're designing collaborative workflows, you're getting buy-in on metrics in designing. Third, you're designing supportive workflows that are really creating value every step of the way. So if you can streamline the workflow to incentivize adoption. So like in our case, we're teeing up the next set of treatments, we're automatically identifying gaps, we're proffering up payer compliant documentation that saves them a lot of pings from the CDI team later. All of those are examples of incentives where if the status quo is, 30 alerts for a true, false alerts for a true alert, that's painful documentation with lots of pings from my CDI team. And if I can create a very seamless alternative, which incentivizes adoption because it's, so that's a sort of, and then all of this meant, and the thing I love about science is that you can repeat it. And so what's been really, really fun is to be able to see this theory now applied over and over again, the way we design, deploy, and scale the system post go live. We've been able to achieve repeatedly upwards of 85% adoption at every single system we've deployed in clinical reasoning. And this is, while the alternatives still see 10 to 12%.
Well, thank you for sharing those stats. They're absolutely incredible. And I wish we could dig into this all day, but unfortunately, we do need to move on due to time. But I think you've done an excellent job of distilling something that is hugely, hugely, hugely complex that I'm sure I can't even appreciate the complexity into very simply talking about the incentives and building it on. And I think you've painted a nice picture of the noise that these clinicians need to deal with. And so thank you for sharing that. And Suchi, one thing I want to kind of double down on in what you've said is a lot of these places are building DIY models and they can't really appreciate the clinical validation, the adoption challenges. They're very small teams working within these organizations. So I want to talk a little bit about that build versus buy. And I know Bobby and Ruben you have obviously evaluated building versus buying, and I'm sure there's certain cases where you do build internally, and there's certain cases where you partner. But can you kind of walk us through how, when it came to your partnership with Suki, how you thought about this decision and how you ultimately decided to partner for that use case?
Is that for me, Julie?
Yeah,
Sorry.
that would be great.
That's
Maybe I'll have Ruben add to it.
yeah, no, I appreciate the question. So this was the original build versus partner decision. I would reframe a little bit as there's just too many use cases that are incredibly interesting and valuable within care management, whether or within the provider space, that you're not building everything is not an option. You can't expect the market to wait for your roadmap when there's that much to do. So it was less of binary build or partner and more of where do we build, and everything else becomes by definition a partner. And so for us, we knew where we wanted to build was where we could do something uniquely better than anything else, which really sat on our data set and our workflows as the core of what we do. And that's where we've been investing our own dollars internally. And literally everything outside of that becomes a partner opportunity. When it came to our partnership with Suki and Ambient, again, this was something that we saw as an opportunity that we could be the driving force in enabling ambient at scale across the payer space. Again, it still remains unpenetrated almost entirely.
Mm-hmm.
If we attempted to build that, it would just take us too long, and the opportunity may pass. And so partner became the obvious choice very, very quickly. We built out once we recognized that, we built out an evaluation matrix, right? Just like any any partnership decision, and we sort of scanned the market and talked to a few potential partners. And Suki was just very clearly rose to the top as the best fit. They checked all the boxes in terms of the immediate opportunities we saw around the documentation of encounters between care managers and members, either in person or telephonically. But really, what interested us the most was a willingness to collaborate. They saw the opportunity as well of this untapped market potential. And as we started to share sort of our day 2, day 3 priorities, a strong willingness to partner with us and align the work they were doing to accommodate the payer space, which is similar but different to the provider space. And so that strategic alignment and that roadmap alignment provides an enormous amount of value, because now we don't just have a partner in the near term for a singular use case. We've got an augmented roadmap of our own capabilities and what we're trying to build that we can then sort of layer and connect the dots between and provide even more value for our customers. So that was kind of like our general process, and really the things that made the difference in sort of who we selected.
Makes sense. And it's really nice, as you said, that this technology hasn't been well adopted by payers, but you could look to another industry and something that is well adopted and bring it in-house. Ruben, I'm curious, you made a very similar decision for your use case partnered with Suki, but are there cases in which you would advise not to partner and build in-house? And can you talk a little bit about the differences?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in our case, we have a very broad platform that it's similar to what Bobby shared. We're focused on our core strengths. So we have sort of what we call our front, back, and middle components of revenue cycle management. The front being the front end clinical documentation, the middle being what we call pre-bill, and the back end being things like reducing denials. And one of our biggest strengths is that we've been able to demonstrate almost $3.5 million of net revenue for health systems per 10,000 discharges. And so that is where our core focus is. But we recognize that we want to bring that forward into the clinical documentation space. And we have a unique vision of how to do that, including the role of ambient to support that. And so we wanted to, in considering build versus partner, we almost kind of wanted to build slash partner. We had aspects that we wanted to build, and we had aspects that we wanted to partner, and it was important to find a partner like Suki that was very flexible in that regard. And so we appreciated, we thought the speed to deployment, the flexibility, the ability to support our unique view, the ability to kind of build the components out within the ambient stack that we wanted to build, and then rely on a partner like Suki for the other components, was really important. And that allowed us to focus on our core strengths and maintain the product coherence across the front, middle, back components of our RCM platform.
All very sensible, and it's great to see that you could do the build slash partner as well. I'm really conscious that I want to get to questions. We have at least 5 there. But Abby, I want to ask you, kind of closing out, and some of our other panelists too, what does winning clinical AI actually look like in 3 years?
Yeah, no, we hear that a lot in terms of what it may look like, and I think we have a belief, and at Suki, ambient clinical intelligence, that we invest in it. I think we have a belief that it will look like one of the 3 things coming together, or all 3 things coming together. One, we believe the AI will become the intelligence layer that's invisible, not a tool that clinician open or use, but full intelligence layer to the workflow, already expanded, that's past documentation into staging orders, flagging care gaps, closing the loop on operational financial side of the visit. And as documentation becomes more table stakes, demand and structural advantage, moving towards the intelligence layer that understands context, surfaces relevant information, and flags gaps across the full encounter. So that's one where it's evolving. Number 2 is I do think winning organizations will have a crisp and defensible answer to what's our core. And I think core is gonna be smaller and smaller. So what's our core 20%, or what's our core 50%, and be comfortable partnering for the other 80. Because the roadmap is, I think Bobby and Ruben are both right. Roadmap is expanding faster than any single team can build alone. So the strategic question is what's core, where we are partnering that accelerates delivery, and what do end users actually want. And third, I will continue emphasizing that what gets underweighted, in my opinion, is adoption. So how do we drive adoption and as a key product or success metric from day one, not as an afterthought. So all 3 things together is how we believe a winning strategy for AI will look like for health systems and health tech partners too.
Thank you, Abby. Suchi, I'm curious to ask you the same question, and it's clear from our previous conversation the emphasis that has gone into that adoption. So I'd love to hear, what do you think clinical AI will look like in 3 years' time?
I think I love Abhi's point of there's so much to do. And I think historically, there's been a combination of I'd say most AI engineers or AI researchers or software engineers didn't have a seat at the table when it came to anything related to clinical transformation, right? In the last 3 years, they now have a seat at the table. And it's not because the technology didn't make sense, it's because our end users didn't believe it, didn't buy it, didn't think it was part of the core strategy. Now, I would hope that, I think now, I'd say we're still in our early innings in the sense that many health system leaders are still wrapping their head around, I'd say transcription, people now feel like, okay, I got to use AI. But in many of the other areas, I still think people don't default to thinking AI is a very highly scalable, high quality, and a transformative strategy. They're still in learn mode. To me, just moving, just playing out the adoption curve, as they build more conviction, I think the idea of having a real-time clinical intelligence layer that is really supporting your clinicians to make the right thing, the easy thing to do proactively, just makes total sense. And part of that is what Abhi said, it's going to be partially not from building this all by one company or one group, because that's just too darn hard to do. But to give that experience to our health system partners, it's going to be an experience where you're taking high quality transcriptions combined with high quality clinical reasoning, combined with follow through with payers on all the collaborations that are needed in order to drive reimbursement document. Like there's just very meaty big rock pieces, and you need these very meaty big rock pieces to come together to create a very seamless stitched experience where ultimately for our providers, they need the data synthesized at their fingertips so that they can act. They can assess, agree, disagree, and act. And then the follow through becomes, as to the extent to which can be automated is automated. I mean, that seems like a pretty beautiful and achievable, like 3 to 5 year like time frame to me.
Thank you, Suchi and Abby. I think it's really exciting as you guys have mentioned. We have one element in the ambient scribing that is so well adopted and understood, but then we have lots of work to do and opportunities, and there's an excitement from your partners on all the possibilities that are achievable over the next kind of 3 to 5 years. And given where we've come the last 2 years, it's super exciting to see what we do. We have a bunch of questions in the chat. I welcome any of you guys to type and answer live so we can get through some of them, but I'll call a couple out now, and thank you to the participants for your questions. So the first one is, based on your experience, what single proof point most effectively turns a clinical AI pilot into a paid scalable deployment? First person, please feel free, and we'll try and be as succinct as possible with the answers to get through a couple.
I can do a quick crack at that. In our
Thank you.
experience, obviously people want to see clinical outcome data when it's clinical, because what's been fascinating to me is they want to see financial data and they want to see clinical data. And those two proof points have been very useful. However, what was most surprising to us that the reason we would get inbounds from health systems is because of our adoption data. What they were very surprised by is they've struggled with driving adoption using internal tooling or some external tooling, and they're reaching out to us because they already recognize that if you could solve the problem, you would get clinical and financial ROI. The problem is you can't solve the problem in the first place because your clinicians aren't going to adopt. So if we were given that we've been able to drive adoption, then the rest of it, they're more, and we're explicitly tackling problems with well-known clinical financial ROI.
Thank you, Suchi. Go ahead, Bobby.
Yes, Suchi, what contributes to your adoption is the users have to love it. If users fall in love with the capability during a pilot, that health plan, health system have a hard time taking that away. And then it's just a matter of figuring out the paperwork and the price model. But if users fall in love with something and because it works well for them and it's easy to use, I think that's what's going to lead to your adoption. That's what's going to lead to the scale.
Probably a lot of CMOs mentioned that in a previous session, all right, that the clinicians loved it so much they couldn't take it away and they just needed to work out the ROI model secondary. So next question, can you share which health systems are really showing maturity at this point of time and adopting AI workflows for their providers? Any health systems that you've found are particularly mature?
I'll share, it won't be a health system and it won't be a name, but the ones that understand the variability that can come with AI and are comfortable with that are the ones that are doing best because they're the ones experimenting and learning and improving and iterating over time. The ones that we're seeing, I'll say lag a little bit are the ones that have the appropriate quality expectations, but they're trying to apply those to a pilot versus a GA solution. So if your governance model says, I need to have 99% accuracy all the time, you're excluded from any pilot of any AI solution for the next several years. But if you can be comfortable with what it is and what it isn't, and comfortable with some of that risks to experiment, I think that's going to give you the head start, and then just you'll naturally have the competitive advantage of speed and adoption from there.
Okay. Thanks, Bobby. Ruben or Abby, please feel free to shout out any health systems. Otherwise, I'll jump to the next question.
I'll give a shout out to two of our health system clients,
Go for it.
Rush and UHealth of Miami. I think leaning in with their strategy, not only having a big picture vision of where they're building, partnering with partners like us, but also putting right measurements in place for, I think Suchi touched on adoption rate, time saved, revenue impact, and looking at that through systems. So I think having partners like that it's a privilege for us because we like to build, we like to work with our partners.
Bravo to them.
I'll name a couple. I mean, I paused because we're in more than 85 health systems, and I didn't want to have anyone feel left out. We have some great partners, but recently I had some great discussions with Parkland Health System, Health and Hospital System in Dallas, Houston Methodist, Novant, University of Colorado, Christus, and Jefferson, and all of those are different types of systems. You have Safety Net Health System, you have academic, you have extremely large multi-IDN, multi-state community hospitals, and all of them have some of those features we've been talking about, which is really forward-thinking thoughts about their own AI roadmap, how they're going to do clinical governance, how do they do safety, and how do you tie clinical and financial return on value together and for AI. So, definitely a shout out to those systems.
Nice. Thank you, Ruben. I'm going to ask this question because it's very practical and focuses on the ROI that we brought up. So integration and interoperability costs are often left out of the total cost of ownership conversion for clinical AI, even though they behave more like recurring maintenance than one-time expenses. Do you see under-budgeted integration costs becoming a leading driver of non-renewal buyer's remorse once the true TCO is clear? Or will realized ROI reliably outweigh it? We probably just have time for one person to address this.
I can address that. I think recurrent realizable ROI, almost like recurrent SaaS. Think about it for the health systems. They need to see recurrent ROI, and they're also battling. Let's say on the provider side. I mean, they're battling profit margins 1% to 2%. I mean, it's pretty tight. So they're completely within their scope of responsibility to their own stakeholders to constantly optimize their technology stack and their AI stack for recurrent ROI. And I think the innovation in the industry is great to provide that and keep improving both on the price and the capability across all these areas.
Thank you, Ruben. And that leaves us just to time. I wanted to say a huge thank you to our panel. Thank you for being so generous with your perspectives and your experiences. I really wish we had a lot more time. We'll have to pick it up again. And thank you to everyone who joined us. We had a huge audience. Thank you for your questions and have a great day.
Please visit our website, HLTH.com, to catch up on all health webinars and watch the recording of today's session. Join us in Las Vegas, November 15th to 18th for Health USA.